Hi everyone, I'm Leanne, and today we're going to have a bit of a bookish career chat. So if you're new here, I want to give you a little bit of context. I am currently celebrating a decade of being on BookTube, of making YouTube videos about books. And one of the things I get asked like semi-frequently is about how being a bookish content creator intersects with having a publishing career. And I would say it's pretty complicated, and I'd say that there are pretty significant pros and also pretty significant cons to having both of those hats that I wear. And I'm gonna split this kind of into two eras. The first of which is the impacts of doing this while trying to get into publishing, but then the impacts of doing this while being established in your career. So I have been making videos about books for 10 years. For the past 6 of those, I have been in publishing. And I am currently a senior key account manager, so I work in sales at a Big 5 publisher. So to give you some wider context, I don't come from the kind of background that I would say traditionally is what you might associate with working in publishing. So like my parents didn't finish school, didn't go to university. I never really had and continue to not really have like an adult or parental figure in my life that I can ask about like corporate jobs. But I will say that whilst neither of my parents were themselves big readers, being a reader and my love for reading was something that was massively encouraged and nurtured in me as a child all the way up through my teenage years. I had amazing English teachers at school as well. And I would certainly say the choices that I made and opportunities I took in my adult life gave me quite a linear path into publishing. And I suppose when people ask me whether having a BookTube channel helped me get my first publishing job, it is so difficult for me to unpick how much weight is placed on that in the context of all of the other things that I was doing. And I want to preface everything I'm about to say with I know so many people who had different routes into publishing than me, routes that weren't as kind of linear on paper, and they are all amazing at their jobs and highly successful. But for me, I did do an English Lit and creative writing degree. Whilst I was at university, I was involved with a number of clubs and societies, most notably being the vice president of the English and Creative Writing Society at my university. So I was involved with lots of kind of bookish events, book sales, open mic nights, poetry slams, author events, creative writing workshops, book clubs. I also had a couple of voluntary positions. So I volunteered at Hono, who are an independent Welsh women's publisher, and also New Welsh Review, who are a literary magazine. Oh, I also volunteered at an Oxfam bookshop, and I think that helped me get my first job in retail, which I did for a year in between doing my BA and doing an MA, so doing a master's. I did my master's in publishing, and whilst I was doing that, I also worked in a bookshop. Now, whether I would recommend doing a master's or some sort of qualification in publishing is kind of a separate conversation, so I'm gonna park that there because that's not what we're here to talk about. We're specifically here to talk about whether content creation helped me get my first role in publishing. And it's just honestly so difficult to tell because I had all of this other experience that I was just kind of building little by little. Oh, whilst I was doing my master's, I also did another volunteer publishing placement. So I had all of these kind of building blocks that were creating a real foundation for me to prove that I would have been good in publishing. And in amongst those was the fact that I had a BookTube channel. There were lots of positives that I could bring to interviews when talking about having a BookTube channel when I was going for those entry-level jobs. Firstly, it just kind of showed that I could talk about books with a level of confidence and fluency. It showed that I was a genuine reader. It showed that I could manage and sustain a project for a long period of time. And it did point to a level of digital literacy. I think there are ways of talking about content creation that really gives credit to those skills that you can bring to the workplace. So it's not just content creation itself, it is long-term project management, it is community building. All of these skills are really relevant to publishing, kind of regardless of what area that you go into. It is impossible for me to pick how much weight this brought to that interview and application process. And I will also say that I think I did a really strong interview for my entry-level job prospects. I don't think that just having this one string to my bow was the thing that helped me get a job. I think I had multiple strings at that point. But having a BookTube channel certainly didn't harm my chances in any way. I think once I got that first entry-level job, something that I became quite cautious about was I didn't want to be like the digital media, digital marketing person. That's not what I saw saw my career being. I very much saw having a BookTube channel as just like a hobby. I just kind of wanted it to be a diary where I spoke about books. I didn't really want to be like an influencer in any kind of significant way. I do think the landscape has changed so much in the past few years, and we are seeing people make that transition from being really successful content creators, more so book talk nowadays, to having their entry-level publishing jobs. And I've seen that have varying degrees of success. But I was quite clear that I didn't want any kind of like social media or content creation aspects to my job. And I think maybe people expected that I was super social media savvy, not just because of having the BookTube channel, but just by virtue of being a young person in the office. So in terms of my assessment as to whether my BookTube channel helped me get into the publishing industry, yeah, I think it helped, but I don't think it's a golden ticket. And that's the same thing that I say about my publishing masters. Yeah, I think it helped, but it was more how I applied myself in that context of that. And also, it's not a golden ticket. Now, when my publishing career started to progress, things started to get, I think, a little bit more complicated in terms of my relationship navigating my career and content creation. So when I was an assistant, I was working in a big 5 publisher across their entire list. So I was working across like literary fiction, commercial fiction, kids, young adult, lifestyle, cookery. I was working across everything. And I was kind of in many ways like an anonymous cog in that machine. I never felt any sort of conflict of interest in talking about books that I got from work on the channel. I didn't really have kind of like relationships with authors. I was just kind of like anonymous in a way. But at the start of 2021, I moved companies. So I went to another big 5 publisher and started specifically working in the children's division. At this point, I still had my BookTube channel as part of my CV. So it was there for the people that were hiring me to take a look at. And again, at this stage, I don't think there was any real cons to that. I think, again, it helped showing that I had a confidence and fluency talking about books. It showed that I could manage a long-term project. It showed that I was a genuinely enthusiastic reader. And it also allowed people to kind of get a sense of me as a person, which I think was a positive thing. But it was at that point that I started to notice some things that were like a conflict of interest. So there were certain opportunities that I was approached with, maybe from other publishers, for instance, to host like live streams or Q&As with authors. And that was just a bit of a conflict of interest for me. So I had to decline those opportunities. And it was at that stage in my career where I was faced with a choice of what I was going to double down on. Was I going to double down on the content creation, or was I going to double down on the career? And I chose the latter. I didn't really think I had the chops to grow this BookTube channel in a substantial way. And also I realized that, you know, proof copies of books don't pay the bills. And it was at that stage that I started to feel a little bit more trepidation of things like my BookTube channel being mentioned to authors, for example. It just made me feel like a little bit shy. I felt like the version of myself that I wanted to bring to work and the version of myself that I wanted to be here were slightly different versions of myself. And I think, you know, that's the same for anything. Like in certain social situations or groups of friends, like you kind of just adapt what bits of your personality, I suppose, like you bring out in certain situations. I think that's very normal. I'm very grateful that I remain at that same publisher that I got like my second job in. I've had really fantastic support from my managers and progression, and I'm very, very happy where I am. But over the years, you know, there have been other opportunities that have come up, other jobs that I've been intrigued by, and I have gone for like interviews. And there came a stage where I decided to take my BookTube channel off my CV, like in the hobbies bit, because when I was asked about my BookTube channel in those interviews, it felt as strange to me as being like asked extensively about like the exercise class that I go to or like the video games that I play, which might sound strange because it's all talking about books. But when they were asking me, you know, questions about how I measure success on the channel, it just felt very odd to me. I was like, this is just my hobby. Like I didn't really want to talk about it in interviews. I was much more interested in, you know, talking about my professional achievements. It felt like it just became a bit of a distraction when I was going into those interviews, so I decided to no longer draw attention to it. I was kind of taking control back a little bit, I guess. Talking about my BookTube channel just really felt irrelevant in those kinds of professional conversations or interviews. I felt like talking about my experience, about my achievements was far more relevant, and I didn't want anything that was going to distract to me talking about that. There are a few more complexities as well now that I find myself 6 years into my career. So when I was talking about entry entry-level jobs, I mentioned the anonymity that I felt. You know, I didn't really feel like I was like representing the company that I worked for. I didn't really feel any sense of like a conflict of interest. Now that I really specifically work in one division of a publisher and kind of like on social media, but also in the bookish world more broadly, there is an association between my personal self and my professional career self. It does slightly change how I conduct myself on the channel, but I think in a way that I have really minimized. So for instance, when I am talking about books that I've read from the place that I work, I typically talk about them at the end of the video, and I do try to keep it quite brief. Now, partially that's for just kind of a level of mental separation for me. And someone could say, well, why don't you just not include any of the books that you read for work in your wrap-ups? Really, my BookTube channel is a reading diary for me, so it doesn't feel right to exclude those books. I just kind of talk about them briefly. But also, I genuinely love so many of the books that we publish where I work. I want to talk about them. I'm excited about them. I enjoyed reading them. Unfortunately, I've never ever found myself in an instance where I have read something for work and I've really not enjoyed it. So I don't feel like I've ever compromised the honesty that I bring to reviewing books. There may be times when the review is slightly more brief than others, but I think it also helps that I specifically work in children's publishing, so I can have a degree of separation from like Leanne the reader to like Leanne like the reviewer, I suppose. Like I can see the merit of a child reading a book, and that's kind of the perspective of reviewing that I come from, rather than if I was reading like a novel for adults. If I did find myself reading one of our books and I didn't like it, I probably wouldn't talk about it, like if I really hated it, but that has never happened. And I can apply that same rule to talking about children's books more broadly and young adult books more broadly. I can understand the merits for the intended audience and review from that perspective. And you know, some of those authors that, you know, I might not have a working relationship with them, but I kind of know them, might be friendly with them. But again, I think specifically being in children's can kind of help with that. And I don't feel like being in the industry compromises my honesty in any way. I think it just impacts the style of review sometimes. I mean, I would never do like hate reviews or rant reviews. That's just like not in my nature, like regardless of my career or not. Like you will have definitely seen negative reviews from me over the years, but kind of going in on something is not what I'm interested in. There are so many like positive things that have come out of me having a BookTube channel though, that really come into play in my like day-to-day life in my career. So a huge part of what I do as a salesperson is doing presentations. Sometimes they can be, you know, sat at a table talking to a few people about our books. Sometimes it involves standing up in a room full of people. I feel incredibly comfortable in those situations. Like as a presenter, I think I'm extremely competent. I think I'm extremely comfortable. I think it's one of the things that I'm best at. And I firmly believe that that is a direct result of having this BookTube channel, of having years and years of building up that skill of talking with kind of passion where necessary, not feeling shy about talking to people. And I used to be an extremely shy person, and I really credit my BookTube channel with changing that for me. I think having a BookTube channel really expanded my awareness of like upcoming releases and recent books. So I think it really developed my knowledge of like the publishing world in that way. I think having relationships with publishers as a content creator kind of helped me understand that relationship before I was on the other side of it. Through BookTube, I met a number of people that were already working in publishing, so they were ways of me kind of getting advice when I didn't have maybe a network in my personal life before where I could ask those kind of questions. It connected me with people that were working in publishing and I could talk to. Having a BookTube channel showed me that I could read more than I was previously. And also going back to the presenting thing briefly, I also think this was particularly handy in 2020 and 2021 when we started doing meetings and presentations online. I remember a lot of people finding that quite jarring, but because I was very accustomed to like seeing my face on a screen or talking to a screen, the transition to that for me was totally seamless. Like I wasn't bothered by it at all. There aren't any sort of firm conclusions to this, right? There are pros and cons to having this hobby simultaneously with the career that I have. And those pros and cons have changed over the years as my career has shifted. I know striking the balance between the two is something that creators who also have publishing jobs allude to and talk about sometimes and kind of struggle to find the balance between between the professional self and the personal online self. Ultimately, I think it's just impossible for me to fully unpick or disconnect these different facets of my life. So much of my life revolves around books. It is my professional life, it is my hobby in a number of different ways. You know, the actual act of reading is my hobby, going to bookshops is my hobby, going to author events is my hobby, making these videos is my hobby, recording my reading data is my hobby, playing Tiny Bookshop on the Nintendo Switch is my hobby. I go to bookshops as part of my job, I go to bookshops as part of my personal life. It is impossible to kind of pull these things apart. But I do think that I have reached a point where I feel quite comfortable in how much I talk about my job on this platform, while still ensuring that this platform remains exactly what I want it to be, which is a reading diary. Also, the landscape for content creation has changed so much since I first started out, since I had my entry-level job. I would be intrigued to hear like book talkers who have entered into the publishing world to talk about their experiences. I do maybe wonder like how much honesty can be brought to that conversation when you're quite early on in your career, or maybe when you're early on in your career like it was for me, it just felt like a bit of a non-issue. But yeah, no real conclusions here, just a kind of ramble, sharing my thoughts. If you are a publishing hopeful, I did make a video maybe 4 or 5 years ago with like some tips, and I've not watched that video back, but I assume that I stand by the advice that I gave. So I will leave that linked if you want to check it out. I am building up a bank of questions as well for doing a Q&A more broadly about 10 years on BookTube. So if there's anything else that you want to ask in a follow-up to what I have spoken about today, or anything at all in relation to the 10 years on BookTube, just leave me a comment down below and I will bring it into the Q&A. That's all I'm going to talk about for now. I hope you're well, and I will speak to you next time.